Good. So I'm delighted to be interviewing Neil MacGregor, who, of course, needs no introduction, director of the British Museum. I'm going to be asking him 4 or 5 questions, and then we'll open it up to you before we break for coffee. So, Neil, let me just start. I mean, I think people will just be fascinated by the kind of nature of your job. So just tell me, today, what's the key issues at the front of your mind as director of the British Museum? What are you worrying about? Is it the small prosaic questions, or is it the big issues that you're grappling with?
Well, I mean, I'm sure as for everybody here, is this working?
Yeah.
I'm sure as for everybody here, it's both. The first question is always conservation of a collection for study. But it's above all the fact that you can't now have a collection like the British Museum without that being shared with the whole world and finding a mechanism for the whole world to engage with it. And that's what I was so interesting about Mike Clark's starting point, about the fact that birds are global, and the Enlightenment debate. The assumption of that always was that the whole notion of an inheritance was not a national inheritance, but for humanity. And how you make a reality of these things belonging to everybody, and the ownership, which is the other key thing. And that's, I think, from a museum, I think it's the most complicated thing to do.
And that notion of that the British Museum is the possession of the citizen, as it were, has been a motif running through your time as director. Just what are the principal ways in which you've tried to bring that idea to life?
Well, the first thing is free admission. I mean, that is absolutely fundamental. The notion that heritage is, after all, fundamental point about heritage is that you own it. You don't consume it. It's not something you're sold or a service. Heritage, in the meaning of the word, is your own, your possessions, what you own. And how the key thing is to make it clear that all our museums are the private collections of every citizen. That means free admission, it means free information, and it means an economy which is not a market economy. And that means that all the motivations of the visitors and of the people working in that world are not necessarily going to be the same as those working in a market economy. We're in a different world.
But part of it, I guess, is about the challenge of popularising, as you did with 100 Objects, for example, that kind of sense of thinking very hard about how it is you can make stuff more accessible to people who might not naturally wander into a museum on a Sunday afternoon.
That's where I think one of the key aspects, the key partner, it seems to me, in any conversation about heritage has got to be the BBC. Absolutely fundamental partner. There are other broadcasters, of course, who can be major partners, but only the BBC has that mix of national, regional, and global already in place. A network that is both about broadcasting in the conventional sense and a digital one. It is the mechanism that will allow more people to engage in their own heritage, to explore it, than any other that we've got. And that seems to be something that the Lottery Fund could play a very large part in. It's not I'm surprised how little it's happened in the past, that real engagement between the BBC, the heritage organisations, and the education system. One of the real startling things of my experience in the time at the National Gallery and the British Museum is how difficult it is for DCMS to speak to the Department for Education. There's never been a structured, sustained debate and never been real cooperation. It's simply astonishing. And this would resolve so many of the questions in that area that we've been talking about.
I mean, your collaboration with the BBC was a remarkable and highly successful thing. A lot of people in the room will be in the business of trying to put together collaborations, and it's one of those words which everybody uses but is much harder to achieve in practice. Have you got any kind of insights you can give us as to how it is you managed to achieve such a powerful collaboration?
It was, well, the 100 Objects collaboration was successful, I think, because it wasn't just between the BBC and the British Museum. It was nationwide with museums across the whole of the UK. And it also was a structure in which individuals could present their objects, as could local museums, So it was a very open structure in that sense. The key point, and I think again it's important, was that everybody agreed that this would be done as public service. There was no financial benefit to either partner at all. It was the first time the BBC had structured such a partnership, that the material would be available without charge to be used by anybody in perpetuity. The same for the museum. There's a model there of really making material available in the public realm that I think is the powerful one.
And did you, I'm just thinking of the presentation that Mike made a while ago and the kind of key elements of how it is you build a kind of partnership. And one of the first things was shared vision. Well, obviously, you clearly had that. The second is is shared data. Did you, when you did the 100 objects, did you have at the outset a set of impact criteria? Or was it just a journey you embarked upon, not really being able to predict whether or not it would capture the public imagination?
Oh, absolutely that. I mean, no idea whether anyone would listen at all. I mean, you sit in a little basement in Portland Place, stopping every now and then the pneumatic drills. But you've no idea whether anyone was listening. There was no idea, I think, at all of the outcome. I mean, simply that this was a thing worth trying. And I think it's got to be that way around. I don't think you can't know the results of the experiment until you've done them.
Now, you just spoke about your relationship with the museum sector as a whole, and of course we've had quite a lot of conversation, controversy about the central, about where assets are distributed, the focus on London. You lend an enormous amount out to the museums across Britain. Just give us an insight into your sense of the responsibility the British Museum has to the wider museum sector, particularly in these kind of challenging times.
Well, I think the model for a collection at the British Museum has got to be a lending library. I mean, that is, as far as possible, what that collection should be. There's one purpose, which is to allow, as far as possible, visitors to walk around the world and make their own tour of the world and their own sense of the world, modern and past. But because the depth of the research collections is what it is, and because they've been so well published, the physical location of individual objects can move a great deal. And the main challenge, I think, is now for the collection of the British Museum to be on the road, not to be travelling, to be seen in different contexts, sometimes for longer periods. For instance, with Glasgow, with Newcastle, with York, we have partnership galleries where long-term loans allow them to explore Egypt or Roman Empire or whatever. But lots of individual objects moving around. That, I think, has got to be the future for the collection. And again, the Lottery Fund has really been very significant collaborator in that, in enabling so many of the smaller museums particularly to borrow in terms of conditions, security, whatever. But constant lending, I think, and travelling is the important point, to let them be seen everywhere.
I want to pick up on a couple of points that have already been flowing through our conversation and get your perspective on this. The first is around public engagement, which has been a recurrent theme. And of course the challenge between, as it were, responding to public opinion, but also the need sometimes to make difficult decisions based upon expertise and innovation. Now, that's an issue for you currently in relation to the reading room, where you've talked about the fact that you want the public voice to be heard, but presumably you also want to kind of make sure that this is a development of the highest possible standards. How are you thinking about navigating that?
Well, I think the reading room is a very good example of the conversations we've been having about a space that was made for a particular purpose. The purpose can no longer be fulfilled in that space, and therefore how does the building move, change, live on in a different way? There are a number, it's also a space that is in a very real sense publicly owned. People feel a great engagement to that space, even if they've never worked in it or indeed never been in it. So the question, I think, is how you construct the debate. What we intend to have is a series of debates, which will then be available afterwards, of course, public debates on the different ways in which that space can help different publics engage with the collection. I mean, the purpose of the room was always to help people think about the history of the world and their place in it, and different ways of making that possible. So we want as many ideas as possible about how the building of the British Museum can now, in today's world, serve the purpose for which it was set up.
And in this same area of debate, clearly the British Museum has to be a key institution in debates about Britishness. And of course the British Museum itself has continuing controversies about its collection, the marbles, etc., and how it stands as a kind of symbol of Britain's past. Do you see your role as actively engaging in those kinds of debates and convening them and contributing to them? Or is there a kind of sense of wanting to stand back from them in a sense that courting controversy is a dangerous thing to do, particularly when you rely on philanthropy and other things where people might not want to be associated with controversy?
No, I think that, well, a couple of things to start with. The name of the museum is quite an odd one. Nobody knows when it was, who decided to call it that. What we do know, it was the first public institution to be called British. It's after the 1745 rebellion, civil war, whatever you want to call it. And it's clearly about a decision to make a certain kind of citizen, and that it's a public collection. The key thing is it's not royal. That was the big distinction. I think it's a British collection. It's the citizen collection, not the government's collection. And that, I think, is the first point, that the key point of that word at that time is that this is not to be under government control. These questions are too important to be controlled politically. And it was to make a new kind of citizen who would be their own citizen and a citizen of the world. So I think the idea of identity in that sense is absolutely central to the museum's role. It's a role that I think is before the, as was about, it's before, it's not about a national identity. It's about citizens finding their individual place in the world. It's absolutely not a nationalist, in any sense, collection, as you can see from the way it was made up. If it's about a particular notion of Britishness, then that notion is about an engagement with the whole of the world. And it is a very remarkable phenomenon that from the beginning, it was always to be about the connections between this country and the whole world, and how they connected and how that relationship between this country and the world moved and changed. So I think to that extent, it's very well placed to return to ideas of identity in a Britain that is, well, the rest, if you like, the world has come to live in Britain. And the idea of a single national identity is no longer sustainable in 19th century sense. And we have to be a place where we provide the evidence, the information for that. So that's one area. But it's not our identity only that we need to try to understand. We felt it very important, for instance, to explore notions of Iranian identity, of Afghan identity. These are very important notions of identity to explore. And there are not many places in our society, other than museums, where all the public can come to address that kind of question.
So final question for me before I open it up to the floor, which is taking that on a step further. Do you think that there's been talk of the sector talking with one voice? There's a certain shrillness often to the nation-state's portrayal of national interest and elements, for example, of Euroscepticism, other aspects of this. But those of us who are involved in the kind of soft diplomacy end of things, in the kind of cultural exchange, need to have a very different way of talking about Britain and Britain's engagement with the world. Do you think that the sector as a whole, or particularly the institutions like your own that operate in this global way, are sufficiently kind of cohesive in terms of that, the way in which they seek to portray Britain, and the way in which they seek for the world to engage with Britain, particularly in, as I say, this rather kind of shrill political atmosphere?
I don't think we weren't set up to do that. We were set up as an 18th century Enlightenment notion of a republic of letters, of a community of inquiry which was worldwide, and of which every citizen who chooses, every scholar, what that wonderful 18th century phrase, every studious and curious person is part of that worldwide community. It's very important that institutions defend that against the politics of the nation state, or at least separate from it. For the trustees of the museum, it was most recently critical in terms of whether we should continue to lend to Iran, exchange with Iran at moments when the political relations were very poor. And the question was, if we do that, are we endorsing a regime that we don't wish to see flourish, or where we feel things are happening that we don't approve of?
And were you put under? Did you feel that you were put under pressure in that
regard?
No.
That's what I was going to say. What was really fascinating in that, because the trustees decided they would lend to Iran because the Iranians had lent so generously to the British Museum, that lending to colleagues, to an institution, was part of that community of inquiry and not endorsing regimes. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office behaved immaculately, absolutely clear that this was a matter for the trustees. That was why trustees had been set up in that way in the 18th century. The original act is quite clearly intended to depoliticize this, take it out of control of government, and they stayed with that very comfortably.
Thank you. Okay, let's take points, questions from the floor, and then I'll bring Neil in before we close the session. We've only got one hand, but it's thrust in the air. So let's go to Anne here, in the middle. Where's the nearest mic? Right, it's the lady there with the yellow tablecloth.
Anne Packard, the issues facing museums in the future will require maybe alternative perspectives, but undoubtedly leadership. And therefore, the question of training and long-term succession planning and so on comes into mind. I ask partly out of ignorance, but is there scope in Britain for something like the Mellon Foundation scheme?
Could you explain a bit what the Mellon Foundation scheme does?
Well, my understanding is that it's a scheme for the placement of high flyers in large institutions in order to equip, as it were, the next generation with skills to assume leadership roles with dynamism, energy and flair at the right time.
Well, I think there's already, others here will know more than I think there's already a great deal of that in existence. The Heritage Lottery Fund has for years been developing exchange of skills programs which work, I think, very well indeed. The Claw Leadership Program has been doing that for some time. There's a growing understanding, I think, on the part of all of us that secondments and mentorings are very important. So I think it happens already a great deal. But it was interesting in Dan's paper, first of all, the fact that so many institutions wanted skills training. And I think that's something we would all want to see developed even further. And again, very much a lottery fund possibility, I think.
Okay, who's next with the question? Yep.
Sharon Heal from the Museums Association. Just on the point of regional funding equity and the British Museum as a lending library, I take that point. I think it very much depends on who has the library card to access it, but also what do you say then to those organisations in the regions which are on their knees and don't have the capacity then perhaps to accept the loans and the tours that you offer? What is the British Museum and other national organisations' role in leadership in that sense?
I think it's the key question, of course. Every museum in the country has the card, and that has been shown. Museums of all scales everywhere in the UK have borrowed. So everybody has the card. The question is the one of resource at the other end. And I think the role of the museums, the national museums, is to argue as strongly as possible, put the case as strongly as possible for the better, proper, sustainable funding of regional museums. That I think is all that can be done. We cannot solve the funding problem. What we can make sure is that if funding is available, we can play every part we can to help regional museums in the way they choose.
Okay, let's just take a final set of questions. There's a gentleman here, there's a lady there, and there's a gentleman over there. So 3 quick points, bringing Neil close.
Jonathan Cardy from Wikimedia UK. Just a question about digital access versus physical access. You seem to be very open about people walking into your museum and museums you're sharing with. How about the same for the rest of the planet? Not everyone can get to a museum.
Okay, and then here.
Joanna Owen, Museums Gallery. Just picking up on the point of the concept of the lending library and echoing Sharon a little bit in terms of who chooses the borrower, in terms of a global sense, and that responsibility in terms of your leadership role in making those heritage connections globally, maintaining the conversation and keeping it open and open to opportunities so that borrowing conversation can be as wide and as far as possible to make the most of that opportunity of the wonderful things that you have.
And then finally.
I just wonder whether you think the British Museum should promote Britishness, and as a Scot living in London, what do you think Britishness is?
That's a nice, easy question for you to end on, Neil. And then I'll ask you how you would be voting in the referendum. No, I won't be asking you. Over to you.
Okay, I was at the digital point. Clearly that is the essential counterpart of free access, is free digital access. And that's a major commitment of the trustees, not only to make all that available free, but to do it in Arabic and Chinese, which we do at the moment. So there's a Chinese website, Arabic website, and the only restriction on that is further funding, so that it is globally usable. On the question of the international global partners, one of the major activities there in terms of lending and sharing are with the continuing indigenous communities. And this is a very important role for the museum. It's often the case, if you take particularly, I'm talking particularly at the moment about Oceania or Australia, where the indigenous communities didn't tend to preserve organic material. They threw it away and made new objects. It was the missionaries, the colonial administrators, whatever, who collected it. So the survival, the objects are mostly in museums. What is fascinating is the way those conversations and loans are now developing. And the museum is in the center of a large exhibition planned for next year, jointly with the National Museum in Canberra, on the Aboriginal narrative of Australia. The title is going to be Enduring Civilization, with the pun that intends, that the Aboriginal civilization did endure, and then they had to endure ours. But it's a perfect example of how the lending can work, that the Aboriginal communities that continue work on the objects, and then they'll be exhibited in Australia, and that will develop. And that is, I think, one of the really fascinating areas for the future. And finally, the question about the British Museum in that sense, it was founded after the first 30 years of the failure of the Hanoverian monarchy to establish itself. It was the moment when clearly politicians in London realized that they needed to think differently about what it meant to be a citizen in a state. And I think the British Museum is a demonstration of the fact that what happened in 18th century Britain was that the intellectual powerhouse of the Scottish universities engaged for the first time with the global activities of the City of London. When the British Museum opens, among the first people there are David Hume and William Robertson in the library in London, for the first time, Oxford and Cambridge mentally, spiritually, brain dead at this stage, as we know. Nothing happening in Oxford and Cambridge, only preparing clergymen for corrupt bishoprics in the Church of England, mostly in Ireland. Anybody who's thinking is thinking in Scotland. And the huge opportunity of the Union was that Scottish intellectual power could be harnessed to the global activities of London. I still believe that to be true. That London is the access point to a world greater than anything else. It is without question the global city of the moment, as it has been for most of the last 250 years. No question of that. If you want, and we find that very clearly the way foreign colleagues want to present material in London. They know that if it's shown in London, the world will see it, the world will discuss it, the world will comment on it. London is that place. And that's why I think the Union is so important, because it keeps Scotland connected to the world, to the whole world, I think more effectively than any other mechanism. I'm allowed to have a private opinion as a public servant, and I have a very strong private opinion. But I'm not allowed to vote.
Neil, thank you so much. So we'll have a coffee break, and then in 25 minutes or so, we may enter into a position of complete chaos, because I'm vacating the chair. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but normal service will resume later in the day. So enjoy your coffee break. We'll be starting again in half an hour or so, but please can I ask you to join me in thanking Neil MacGregor.